COIN, Community Oriented Integration Network, is a network of friends, people of experience, who explore how to develop local communities for health, compassionate communities.
Just to say that the meeting, as you'll have seen on your screen, is being recorded just for your information.
So just to invite people who haven't seen for a little while, and or new people, and I think Jane's new today, to say who they are. Then other people who are been here more recently can introduce themselves when they speak later on.
I'm a retired GP, still active teaching medical ethics at Imperial and other places, and I'm chair of the Human Values in Healthcare Forum. My co-trustee is involved in compassionate communities in Somerset.
Yes, and you, Paul, and David, Colin Tomey. You might remember me. And Steve Iliff, I know
It's
a few people.
The old fogies club, isn't it?
Old fogies, yeah, terribly old fogies. GP's retired family doctor in Sheffield, and I've known people like Paul for, I don't know, 30 years, but probably more, but not been in touch very much. But, you know, we're still active in things. So I'm also, just very briefly, I'm the chair of a thing called the Pioneer Health Foundation, which keeps the legacy of the Peckham experiment. Still involved with my local neighbourhoods wellbeing group. So I'm interested in the care as well, the social care aspect. So that's me for now.
Jack, weren't you instrumental in making a Gouda happen some decades ago?
Yes, and you were, I think, as well. I can't.
The Association of General Practice in Urban Deprived Areas in the 1980s facilitated discussions between cities where leading radical general practices sort of held a conference once a year, and people from different parts of the country came to it. And I always think that COIN started there, actually. So anyway,
I'm here on behalf of Helen Howson from the Bevan Commission, which is Wales's health and care think tank. I'm the international lead in the Bevan Commission, whilst I was Director of Research and Development in the International Foundation for Integrated Care. So I think what you're describing about compassionate communities and such like has very much been a topic within IFIC over many years, and always features at its international conference. So I'm looking forward to connecting with you, learning a little bit more about what you're about, and potentially finding out how I might be able to contribute, as well as Helen, to the good work that you're clearly doing.
Everybody, retired GP. Paul and I are going off to London on 2 separate trips, one to meet a senior civil servant, and also we're going to meet the chair of the Royal College of GPs, Camilla Hawthorne, on I think the 19th, so that to try and see if we can get more COIN fans and supporters, and maybe even help to push the policy nationally.
So I've worked as a head of production in film and television companies over 44 years, and I worked in documentaries making mostly social issue based docs. Now I walked away from that. Recently I completed a course as an end-of-life doula.
Everyone, thank you for having me. I'm from Florianópolis, Brazil, but I live in Rio de Janeiro since 2009. I came here to work as a screenwriter for TV and cinema. Before I worked as an advertising copywriter, and I've worked in Global TV as a drama project analyst, later as a screenwriter for TV series and morning shows. And in Global TV, I already met Rodrigo Fonseca, and I currently speaking to you guys from Rio right now. Very hot here, people.
Claro, David, muito obrigado. Eu posso falar pouco de português, mas não sei.
Wonderful.
Vamos.
So one of the ideas we've often put out is that the things that COIN stands for are very difficult to translate into words. It sounds like jargon and rather difficult stuff, whereas it can translate into images and videos more easily often, especially when it's relatable to whoever's watching it. And we're hoping that David and Rodrigo from Rio can be applying that kind of thinking in the taking videos of the Brazilian community health workers.
Julia, would you be happy to start with your discussion, please?
David Colintomi, it's really nice to see you again. You and I work together in the Department of Health and Social Care, so I'll come on to that as part of my introduction. So I thought it would be worthwhile me just talking about myself a little bit, like you've done, so that you understand where I'm coming from. And then Paul asked me to take the 5 initiatives that you have. I will do that, but having looked again at where the policy is, where the drivers are, thinking about the current position and opportunities for COIN, I thought it might be worthwhile pausing and reflecting a little on some of the King's Fund and the various policies that have been developed, and I'm going to use a particular format for doing that. So 6 key drivers or areas, so I'm going to go on to those. I think I might start with those and then comment on your initiatives and think about how they might link. So I hope that's helpful. If it's not, then it's not a wasted evening, I'm sure. So I began life as a nurse. I trained at St Thomas's Hospital, 3 years, thoroughly enjoyed it. But towards the end, I began to realize that there were other ways of working with people. And so I decided to retrain another 3 years in social work. So I am a qualified social worker. I did further training at the Tavistock and some complicated work, particularly with children and families and safeguarding, called child protection in those days. So I'm really interested, and I'll come on to neighbourhoods in a minute. I'm really interested in the whole plethora of humankind, if you like, and how neighbourhoods work and how we help and work with each other. I'm a grandmother now, so time has gone on and will continue to go on, hopefully for a while longer. So I trained as a nurse. I'm the author of 3 books. The first one I wrote when I was a nurse in palliative care, oncology for children, called When People Die. And it was written for children, Marie Curie. So that's really not relevant for this evening, but I thought I'd mention it. I then moved on and wrote, when I moved out of social work, this book called Call the Social. It's in my biography, which I put into the chat. Call the Social is a bit like Call the Midwife. And I mention it because I think it's useful for this conversation. Call the Midwife is about communities, very old-fashioned communities, yes, but communities, and how the different GPs, very much to the fore, nurses and others and the church interrelate. Now, we don't want to go back to those days. Of course we don't. They were poor, horrible, difficult days with all sorts of setbacks. But we have setbacks now, and one of the big questions for me is whether it is naive to expect to return to true neighbourhood communities and community working. I don't know. And so for me, the jury is out. So I'm fascinated with what you're doing and where you might go with it. And I'm quite optimistic, but a little bit cynical about it, because the old days weren't all that they held up to be. So I became a social worker, working mainly with children and families, but also with other areas. I then moved on to become a manager and but I worked in Scotland for a long time, and then came to London, the London Borough of Barking and Dagenham, which was the Socialist Republic of those of you who know Barking and Dagenham, those of you who don't, very poor working class, white, proud of it, white working class and proud of it, and educated its children to be the same. So I was brought in because it went on to special measures, and I was brought in to change it around. One of the changes I did, and this I think, David, you might remember, was to become chief exec of the PCT, which is the primary care organisation in Barking and Dagenham. So I held both jobs at the same time, Director of Social Services and Chief Exec of the PCT. And we set up one of the first care trusts in the country. It was way back. I dread to think how long. It lasted for 3 years. What we did was really exciting because I understood the value of GPs and general practice and primary care. And very few of my colleagues did in social care and social services. However, I did, and I've always rated GPs as being the focus of what we can do in the communities, because GPs know their communities, really, they know the health and well-being of their communities incredibly well. They are also very good at networking. So we set up neighbourhood teams with our GPs, focusing with social workers, working with the GP teams, and created this really interesting, different way of working. It didn't last, and it didn't last because the NHS is the NHS, and it did exactly what it's been doing and what is in danger of doing now is just look at hospital care and look at healthcare and use that data and worry about that as though that's all that mattered. I then moved on to work with David Colin-Tomey in the Department of Health and Social Care, running the Social Care Improvement Programme. So social care is, as well, you know what social care is. It's almost everything. It's hard to define. Social work, on the other hand, is a specific profession and is integral to social care. So I'm in touch, if you like, with the front line, and some of that has changed enormously. So we must be very careful about having, like Call the Midwife, preconceived ideas about how social work operates now, because it doesn't operate in the way that I would like it to operate. However, there will be opportunities, and I'll come on to that in just a minute. I then moved on and work in predictive analytics. So I joined a startup program for digital interventions and looked at care pathways, integrating the data across health and social care in a very forward-looking way. I don't think the sector was ready for it. So although we did some fascinating work on the way GPs operated, so people would bypass their GP. We found out that data in Derby, they would go straight to the local hospital rather than go to their GP, simply because it was the easiest thing to do. And also because there was a large community of Polish people living in that particular area. And Polish people don't use GPs, they don't use general practice, they use hospitals. So all sorts of things intervened that we didn't, it's the black swan thing, isn't it? Intervened in ways that we didn't expect. So digital transformation is incredibly important, and I think that's one of the gaps that you've got, but I'll come on to that in a minute. Unless we use the data, the NHS will continue to use the data that is acute driven. So we need to use the data, we need to use public health data to inform us on what local communities are doing and neighbourhoods are doing. And it's perfectly possible now. We've got all the means of doing it. So I'm a fellow of the Royal Society of Medicine. I serve on the Digital Health Council, and I wrote this book about robots, tongue-in-cheek a bit, dystopian book about the laughing robot that talks about 10 years ahead, are we going to be using social care robots, and what would it look like? And what would it look like on the Isle of Wight if everyone was sent to the Isle of Wight for rehabilitation? Barking and Dagenham was a place that was built after the last war. It was homes built for heroes. So it was built on 17 wards, 17 small communities. Each one of them had a library, had a playground, had a school, primary school anyway, and they were all centred and had a, what's it called, community centre. So they were all centred around these wards and these communities. So an amazing development. It didn't work out for other reasons, but it was a prime example of neighbourhood and community development. So I've taken Richard Humphreys, and I've got it in the chat. So a paper called Shaping Neighbourhood Care, the Role of Adult Social Services in Transforming Health and Wellbeing. And it looks at 6 drivers that I think would be really useful to check against what you think about the progress that you could be making. It also talks about neighbourhood health service, and I'm sure Paul and others have come across it. And the white paper in 2006, Our Health, Our Care, Our Say. But more importantly, it looks at the Fuller Stocktake report, which said of ICBs, integrated care boards, which were introduced, I don't know, about 4 or 5 years ago. So it says of the Fuller Stocktake report, which proposed integrated neighbourhood teams driven by primary care. And I know that's happened in some parts of the country, and I applaud you if you're in touch with those, but it hasn't gone as far as I think it could and should. So 6 key design areas. The first is a vision for neighbourhood care. Must avoid simply shifting a medical model of care from hospitals into the community. You know that. You know it's very clear, and yet we see it repeated again and again and again. Prevention and well-being, alongside offering joined-up support and treatment for individuals, should be its central aims. Of course it should, having that base. Second one is bottom-up ideas. No point in pushing them down, which is what happened to me in Barking and Dagenham. The NHS tried to impose. We've got to build it bottom-up, so we've got to build it in clusters of localities. The NHS Confederation report on the case for neighbourhood health and care offers plenty of examples. And number 4 is imaginative thinking will be needed to develop financial and policy levers, because unless you've got the right financial and policy levers to make those changes, then you don't get the rebalancing of investment. You carry on with the investment, which has increased, I don't know, somewhere between 12 and 14, 15% over the last couple of years in the acute sector. And so you need to have that. I would argue you also need to have data which moves across activity and health and understands health and social care. So things like virtual wards, for example, or things like falls prevention, where you can do things on a community basis. I think the deinstitutionalisation of mental health services, which are going to be coming with the new legislation. So we know that probably the urge towards to have more mental health beds has now been looked at afresh, and actually supporting people in the community is the right way forward. Number 5 is developing care closer to home. And that is something we really need to push our social care and local authorities to do, because if they do that, and they can do it, then they will find that that's the sort of thing that makes a difference and actually brings down hospital admissions. 6 is the last one. It's this last one. I'll send you the link for this when I've finished. Is making progress on neighbourhood care. Depends on assembling a coalition of willing across all key partners. But I think that misses a trick too, because it's not just all about all key partners. It's about the people. It's about co-production. It's about actually starting with people who want things to be different and working with them. So what we call in social work, experts by experience. So one of the first things I did as chair of the national UK-wide council was to say, you might call them patient representatives. I need people who are experts by experience on council to challenge us as professionals. The other thing that struck me in listening to you as you were introducing yourselves was talking about telling stories. Telling stories and being able to describe what is happening is the way to build neighbourhood bodies and neighbourhood working together. Because that makes sense to people, and you need the people with you. You can't build them. You can't build communities without being in that community. And GPs, for all their worth in the world, and social workers can't do it you shouldn't do it to people. You need to do it with them. So actually bringing the stories alive to people who are living in those communities is absolutely key.
Sorry, my background, Julia, is social work, and I'm working with BASW in making a film about my late wife's role as a social worker. And part of the purpose of the film is to create an opportunity, a platform on which we can explore some of the tricky dynamics about social work's role as both doing what it should be doing in the way you've just described it, of being alongside within communities and so on, and yet dealing with the must-do issues of public protection and all those, and safeguarding the things that social workers have to do as well. And the narrative that I want the film to contribute to is an understanding of perhaps re-envisioning social work, reimagining social work as actually being able again to do both of those things, rather than as separating them as binaries. And I think that holistic approach to what social work once was needs to be rediscovered and needs to be reformulated. And
I think that's absolutely right, David. And you weren't introduced at the beginning, so I thought maybe. But I know that your background, and Ruth, our chief exec, has sort of introduced you to me off, so I'm aware of that.
Right,
and really welcome what you're doing, because telling stories in whatever form is absolutely essential. The problem with what you're suggesting, as I know you know, and others will know, is that the government and the regulators are imposing certain codes of conduct, if you like, on social workers, whereas most of them, the students I was talking to this morning, really excited about being able to change the world and being able to work with people and use all those skills, develop those skills and use them. And yet the regulators are, I'm afraid, imposing constraints that are going to make that quite difficult. So we may need to look to the voluntary sector for doing some, or I don't know. I don't know what the answer is.
Isn't this the same issue for GPs? Dealing with the problem, the problem in front of you versus developing healthy communities and individuals. My wife died 4 or 5 years ago, and we had a very difficult 4 years in the dying at home bit. And I had 2 teenage boys there at the time. It came to the stage of a social work investigation on whether or not I was abusing my children or something like that. And I was absolutely struck by how professional and caring and good the individual social worker was. But she never actually asked the question, it seems you're in a rather difficult place, is there anything we can do to help? She was terribly satisfied that they didn't need to pursue it any further, but wasn't able to notice that we were in deep trouble. And I wonder, and I'm not complaining about her at all. It was clear she had a brief, and I'm thinking, I would like to see social workers, GPs, and maybe everyday citizens, and maybe all doctors, being skilled to jump between one mindset and another, the controlling and linear atomized problem-solving mindset and the empowering community development, health promoting mindset, like as though they're 2 parts of you that you have to dip in and out of. That wasn't really a question, was it? It was a rant.
It was a good rant, though, because obviously that's what we would all want from our professionals, and certainly I would want from social workers working in the professional association, and would expect that. We've got a program. Oh, Jack's coming in. Let me just finish on what I'm saying, Jack, and then it'd be interesting to hear. We've got a program at the moment called 80/20, and we're trying to shift the work from 80% of working in admin and 20% on direct contact with working with people, from the other way around, basically. And I reckon the only way we can do that is looking at how we use AI in future in its various forms. And I'm hoping we could make progress on that. So I'm worried about it. And I'm sorry to hear your experience, as I always am, when people are somehow really surprisingly let down by their social workers, because that's, well, why would you leave that gap? Why?
I suppose inspired by the Peckham experiment, which I mentioned earlier, and which certainly David Colin-Toby was involved with. I set up it's called Dharma Wellbeing, which is a voluntary community and voluntary sector organisation in the late 90s to run alongside the GP practice I was in, and try to have these several mindsets that you're talking about, Paul. So the GP mindset of individual, looking after the patient in front of you, but also developing a sort of family, more of a family focus. So you're looking after the whole family, which of course GPs do, they're family doctors, but also then extending that into the community and the neighborhood that you serve. And having those two, I mean, it wasn't possible to properly integrate that into the NHS, and we've talked about how difficult that is. But having a separate organisation that works really close, co-located, working closely with each other, just did enable the sort of neighbourhood and community aspect to be developed. And I've been retired nearly 15 years now, but I'm still involved with that community organisation, which is within the practice in the same building, and trying to change the way general practice is from being so medically focused into being much more community. In public health, GPs should be doing public health.
There's several issues here. Social work, a bit like general practice, seems to have got weighed down by the hospital model of culture and thinking, and become much more, to use Paul's phrase, atomized and more technical and distant from relational development, really. And that's quite a thing we have to do to change that culture. Because increasingly I see general practice. I know they've had a tough time post-COVID and sheer volume, and they've been as underfunded as anybody. But there's also a cultural shift from my earlier days of just seeing the patient in front of you and next, rather than that relational model. And Hilary Cottam, I don't know if you rate her work, but she very much was focusing that on social services, getting more specialized and impersonal. And one of the things that maybe COIN has to do is how do we reverse the power and status of the primary care? Because in a way we seem to be following the model of the bigger acute sector approach. So when I was, many years ago, I developed this concept of the primary care home, which was a home for all people who work in health and care around the community. All right, I defined it as a GP population because that was the only population around which wasn't statist and imposed like local authority ones. And there was a living thing there. And the reason I'm attracted to COIN is that seems to be the next step, that it's as much a home for the public and patients, and that they are the partners. That seems to be the development. But it's heavily predicated on a relational model. And our professions seem to be going the other way. And that seems to be some of the work that maybe has to be done, or how do we refresh that? When we're talking with the chair of the GPs, who subscribes to that broad view, and anyway, that old-fashioned view, some people say, of general practice, how do we recapture that? Increasingly, when I worked closely with social services as a young doctor, I had a relation approach with people around the case, but it became much more episodic, the input from social care. I know part of that because of short staffing and all the other things, but I worry that despite all those pressures, there's a cultural shift amongst people in primary and community services, which is going the wrong way.
I just wanted to say how much I agree. So the question is how, and can COIN do that, and how would it do it, and how would it persuade others, to do it?
Well, I'm David Peters. Hi, I'm another retired GP, also emeritus at University of Westminster, and I edit a journal called Holistic Care, Holistic Health Care. And on the one hand, I'm quite preoccupied with burnout, and it's an epidemic of it, and staff well-being, doctor well-being. But I'm also increasingly concerned about the industrialization of healthcare and the industrial mindset that is adapting to it. And so I can see why increasingly GPs are in the diagnosis and treatment guidelines, treatment business. I wonder if the same thing has happened in social care, especially when there's so much media surveillance of what social workers do or don't do. And I imagine that must really restrict, and not least if you were talking about regulating codes of conduct and how that may be limiting social workers' ability to work relationally or to do the health creation part rather than just the diagnosis and safeguarding part. But I just think they're parallel processes really in primary care and in social work. But it takes me back to that question is, well, what is a 21st century neighborhood? What is a neighbor? And we can't go back to call them midwife, even we like the nice bits. we can't even go back to the 1970s ability in general practice to be relational and fairly innovative. We are really, really constrained now in what we are allowed to do or expected to do. So I don't know how to reverse that. But the journal, as I would explain, is about stories from the front line, experiences of innovation, of humanizing healthcare, of attempts to put the heart back into healthcare, social work, nursing. So not that we can bounce back, but how do we use the constraints and difficulties of this moment in our culture to bounce forward?
Sorry, Tony Birch, retired GP in Northwest London. I'm currently, well, I've just become chair of Age UK London, which campaigns for an age-friendly London. And I'm involved in a campaign for an age-friendly Brent, which is where I live and I worked. And that is trying to, well, it's attempting to give older people a voice, and a voice that is heard, but it's also about creating communities. And I want to agree with the last two speakers who've talked about the industrialization or the hospitalization of primary care and social work. And I don't know if it's a societal phenomenon where we're running away from dependency needs, and it's regarded as the D word is a dirty word, rather than what I've always really thought about since I discovered it was attachment theory and the importance of attachment, particularly at important times of life, but it goes much deeper than that. And what my relational work in general practice was based on. And I'm sorry about joining the meeting late, but I did join when Jane was talking about her experience in palliative care. It started with a family, long family link with the hospice movement. And after I left school, I worked for 2 months as a ward orderly at St. Christopher's. And I didn't realize until more recently how much that had rubbed off on me, and the importance of attachment and relational work. And I'm quietly despairing of the way that things are going, but we've got to look positive and look forward and think together about how we can respond to this industrialization. I'm on the PPG, my practices patient participation group, and clearly a lot of the staff there are burnt out, they're defensive, they're rigid, everything's the patient's fault. And a mantra recently when responding to compulsory triage of patients, so you can't just book an appointment with a doctor, you've got to be triaged, is that patients have got to take responsibility. And that is just another way of blaming patients, I'm afraid, and it makes my blood boil. So that's my rant. I'm really interested to hear about positive ideas, because I'm sure I've got them as well. It's really difficult to name them and to have confidence that we've got some positive ideas and thinking beyond the importance of relational practice and the building of communities. I think communities are really important. I live in a hugely diverse community. I was reminded when I was jabbing people 4 years ago that I had patients from all over the world, and that was not an exaggeration. And I walk down the street and I hear any number of languages, and I feel quite at home because this is my home. And how do you manage that, and how do you deal with it? It's not without its problems, but there is a way of living with this and making it work. And I suppose I'm interested in thinking a little bit differently about how we go forward with this.
David Peters was saying that doctors feel that they're not allowed to do things. I've heard this from hospital doctors too. And given that I can't think of a group of professionals who have got more locus of control than doctors, that's a despairing message for all of us. And I think in one sense it's been convenient for us to do that and whinge rather than actually doing the painful thing and become leaders in some of these developments that we're talking about. I don't think, to pick up what Julie said, that COIN can do that on its own, but COIN could enhance some local work where pockets can begin to show there's a different model. I don't want to go on about this primary care home, but I sort of originated this idea, and it was voluntary at first. And the feedback we got, apart from some of the referral patterns and all that, was I've never had so much fun for years and all that stuff. It was the personal feelings or energy that we managed to get in these 200 odd sites around the country. Everybody who worked in health and care in this defined area. And of course, the government liked it and decided to make them primary care networks. But of course, as soon as you nationalize the bloody thing, then it becomes an organization led top down and has to stick by rules. And how can we find pockets, which Paul and I have been trying to do with some of the discussions we've had with people like James Kingsland, how can we find some primary care networks or whatever Wes Streeting wants to call these neighborhood groupings that can just go and do it? And I've generally found in my life that if you just go and do it and people locally seem to support it, it's rare that people will stop you or will have enough power to stop you if the feedback is good. And then we generate energy amongst ourselves. That's what we have to adopt. I don't think COIN can do it alone, but having the public and patients as part of this grouping enhances that model rather than just being a professional domain. And that seems to be where we have to go to get back our confidence and our autonomy. You have to be accountable in your autonomy, but not the compliance model of autonomy that we have in the healthcare. But as soon as you nationalise in our health service model, and this may apply to social care too, it's not just the rules from above, but somehow the whole everybody loses energy.
Relational work of the kind we're discussing needs to be generated in a way that derives from service models that engage specialist services. And I think the kind of binary distinction between primary and secondary services, at least in mental health and possibly elsewhere, can sometimes work against the potential for specialist providers and indeed commissioners to play a part in developing the community paradigm that we are talking about. I'm just, as we're talking, I'm thinking back to the mental health centre in the 1980s that I led the development of in Lewisham, which was actively involved in bringing together psychiatrists and community workers and the local community in South Lewisham who wanted a mental health centre, though they wanted to call it a stress centre. And it took 5 years to set it up, but the whole ethos was that we wouldn't turn anybody away. We'd have an open door approach to people who had situational mental health issues, marital issues, etc., or psychosis. And we had, for a time, we had people coming together in this way, and it had, I think, extremely positive outcomes for an otherwise stigmatizing community who began by being very critical of what we were doing, except those people within it who said they wanted to service. Gradually, those people became our key allies. Those most cynical became the people that ran the boot fairs in the grounds of the mental health centre to raise money for it. And they were the NIMBYs. They were the people that said, well, we don't want people who have got established mental health services here, thank you very much, mental health problems. So I think it was a model which then struggled to survive because it went the way of so many other models of care. There was a rationing, a sense that we were doing too much for people who didn't need it enough. But actually, what we were doing was a lot to generate community health in that neighbourhood. We wouldn't have done it without the specialist services contributing, however. So it's just
when I was in Liverpool, in Ealing, we set up this facility whereby GPs particularly, but there were others, were able to ring a key person in the hospital and in real time be put through to a specialist in the thing that was bothering them at that time. That all doctors, specialists and generalists, need to be able to dip in and out of specialist and generalist mindsets. You need to see the whole picture, you need to see the small parts. And whichever small part you see is your specialism. But otherwise, apart from that, everyone needs to be able to see the whole, actually. And if these bright young things that are very altruistic and top of the pile, so to speak, are so good, well, surely they can do it.
You're absolutely right. On the other hand, or as well as, if you like, I've just moved to Greenwich and it's a wonderful villagey type community. My local GP is superb, and what he seems to have, which the GP in Tower Hamlets didn't have, was this network of other GPs who were specialists. And instead of having to go to the acute sector to have particular forms of surgery or looking at various things in a whole range of specialities, they shared that network. So I had assumed that when your item out of the 5 items, primary care networks, I had assumed that expertise would be grown there. That seems to me to be an incredibly positive way forward. See, and it could be with social work too. If you that network of so I had one of my wrists, yes, okay, so I had that tunnel carpal thing, and the local GP said I'll do it, and I said, well, had to go to UCL before, and they said no, I'll do it, and the next week he did, and and they have physio, and they work hard at managing those services, so, and that felt really good to me. So if primary care networks can do that, rather than look to the acute sector, let the acute sector come to primary care, for heaven's sake.
Yes, exactly.
When someone here in the meeting said the stories of the front line, I believe that this has a lot of power to bring awareness. Okay, it's very obvious that stories can bring awareness, but it can strengthen the cause and bring together not only people, but to make connections, to reinforce the need to gain what you need on your objectives. So hearing what you're saying, I believe there's a lot of prime matter in terms of stories to work to your objectives here. I listen to a lot of things that we have some parallels here in Brazil on the primary care. We call them here family doctors, the community doctors, the GPs here, the units we have. So you can have some mirroring, so we can give attention to the issues you are bringing here. So I'm very enthusiastic about what you bring to this meeting today, and I still believe that the power of the stories can be a way to at least a first step to solve one of the questions and objectives that you're bringing today to this conversation. Thank you.
I totally agree with what my fellow Brazilian friend David has said. I've left some suggestions of 3 movies on the chat here. Costa Gavras' The Last Breath, Almodovar's The Room Next Door, and the documentary Man Superman. I wrote it at the chat. Just to be quick, first of all, I'm sorry because I'm outside, I'm in the street, so it's a little bit noisy, but I'll try to be quick. I work with movies as well as David. I'm a screenwriter and I'm a movie critic and a movie researcher. And I have to tell you guys that we are living now a very strong wave of movies about healthcare and about euthanasia and about dignity in the end of life. So everyone in the movies, Chinese movies, Spanish movies, French movies, American movies, everywhere, they are talking about the loss of mental health, the loss of physical body health, and how to cope with this biological condition with moral dignity, with ethical dignity. So we have a theme, we have an issue in the air, talking about movies, talking about drama, and I think we as a group have to think how to somehow establish a dialogue with that tendency that's very strong in media, that's very strong in cinema, that's very strong everywhere in the art field. So I think you should watch those movies. I suggested some. We have some movies about it in Netflix and Amazon. I can find, I mean, Prime Video. I can suggest some ideas, but I really would like if you could take a look at Almodovar's The Room Next Door, because it's an amazing path to discuss this. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Because I know Rodrigo a bit, and I know that he doesn't only know the films, he knows the producers and the actors and everybody personally. Can I just throw in one thing here about to Rodrigo and David particularly? I think these things are everywhere. The issue is more access and having your eyes open than needing too many ideas. One thin example, my neighbor died a fortnight ago. And he really, really, really wanted to die at home, and so did his wife. And said, look, I know I'm dying, but we've got the palliative care nurses agreed. We've got my neighbour ready to come in and the carer ready to come in. We've got oxygen waiting at home, but I really want to die at home. And the wife said exactly the same thing. And the response from the specialist there was, you're too sick to go home. Well, that would make quite an interesting 7 minutes short, wouldn't it?
What we all have in common is we're either telling people stories or we're listening to people's stories, and we are intervening and becoming part of other people's stories. And I think that's something that's really powerful. Thank you.
What you described is a perfect example of a story from the front line. And we can also exploit the two sides, the medical, that the doctor who may be restrained to leave someone to die at home, and the patient side. So that reinforcing what Rodrigo said, there's an idea and the concept in the air. We can feel it. And I believe that's a lot of material from you that we can distill it, transform it into storytelling, very powerful storytelling.
Idea of telling stories is so important, because that's what the government will hear, and telling those stories in a way that makes sense to them will be enormously important. The other point is the analog to digital. For heaven's sake, we have got to be real. We may not have robots in 10 years' time, although I think we will do, but we do need to use AI, and you need to be talking about AI. And if you don't talk about data and integrated data and predictive analytics, then you're missing something big. Shifting from its treatment to prevention, isn't it? Yeah. Wow. I mean, the government needs to do that. They know they need to do it. And yet so often now we are looking for treatment and not for prevention. And self-care seems to have gone out of the window. I don't quite understand that. Anyway, I'm rambling. Sorry, it's got a bit late. I'm going to stop now. 15 minutes to go. So
Catherine's got her hand up. Catherine, Kat?
You guys hear me? I seem to have a few frozen pictures here. All good, all good. Hi. Sorry, I've been quite quiet tonight. I've really been taking it all in. This very topic was quite close to my own story and my own struggles in medicine. I've told it before, so I quite waited a bit late with it. But what I wanted to say was that the juniors do feel it, like you said, Julia. The whole shift of coming in. So I made the mistake as a young doctor in 2021 thinking that I was going to come out and help people. And I thought that treatment and prevention of medical disorders was part of helping people. But after 6 months in cardiology, it seemed to me that people went out the window, and I was only really looking at treatment and disease, really. And yeah, it was hard for me to notice that sort of humanity had gone out the window completely, and then ended in general practice, where it sort of came back only to be held back by protocols and guidelines that seem to be laws more than they seem to be guiding me, really. I don't know why we're not speaking up more about it. I think there was a general consensus when I spoke to one of my superior about it. They say, just make sure you keep your back free, and then you can look at the patient's airways and what the patient needs. And that really sort of became the culture that we were, if you spoke up, oh, well, that's how it is, just crack on with it. You need to sort this, sort that. And then it didn't really matter what the person needed. We looked just at the specialized parts of it, not at the human at all.
awful sort of thing to be introduced to in your first time in London, to be told keep your back clean, and you'll be okay.
Was it just in London though, or were you talking about your Danish experience, Catherine?
That was my Danish experience when I was in cardiology, but to be fair, I practiced in general practice in both Denmark and Norway as well, where we made the same thing. I wanted to have a patient die at home that wished to die at home, but to be connected to the Norwegian palliative care center there, they had to be admitted to then be sent home. And she was too frail and did not want to go in, and I had a terrible discussion and ended up doing my own palliative care package with her because otherwise she would have to go into the hospital, and she simply didn't want to. And then they wouldn't help me from the palliative care center because that was against protocol.
Yeah.
Deep breath.
Yes. Count to 10. It was very hard. It was a very heartbreaking time.
Yeah, so in other words, this is an issue which isn't exclusive to this sceptred isle.
Oh, it's all over. And you would think that Scandinavia and, boasting on their great social care had this down, but seems to be a universal problem.
Yeah. Julia, I just wanted to comment a little bit about what you've been saying and also the discussion in general. And one of the things that strikes me quite often when we have these discussions on COIN, and it certainly happened again for me this evening, is I hear so many good examples of great practice which has occurred at different times in different places. And in every case, practically, it seems to have disappeared. In other words, it happened, but then it didn't become disseminated, it didn't become embedded locally or nationally. And I just wonder, where we can sort of break out from that cycle of successful pockets disappearing, possibly due to the fact that the people that started it moved on, and then people that came afterwards didn't take it up again. Just thinking about the examples that we've heard this evening alone. And I've also wondered, you mentioned the Isle of Wight, you live on the Isle of Wight, and I got the impression from what you were saying that even there, in that very small community, I'm vaguely familiar with it, where everybody knows everybody, you've seen that it's not successfully developed a very good model of community practice. Is that right? Or
that I think the pull of the acute sector has been so strong that the primary care sector has got neglected, and I think the pull has been disastrous actually for the future health of the population on the Isle of Wight. So it happens, and unless that centralisation of the NHS, which says do it bottom up, and the region has to be obeyed, then and the department has to be obeyed, then unless that changes, it's hard to work against the grain, I think.
Yeah.
Only to say that our journal exists to be a shop window for that kind of innovation. We've got a 20-year archive of brilliant practice that may or may not have burnt itself out, but it's there. But what I wanted to say was that the journal we've just published is all about end-of-life care, and some really fascinating testimony from non-professionals, or you would say non-orthodox professionals, including doulas. And I wonder whether this is where we should be looking in terms of community empowerment, deprofessionalizing a lot of stuff which is really health creation. I mean, teachers are health creators, for goodness sake. Policemen can be health creators. But so much depends on a shift in attitude to look at what it is that actually builds human well-being. And yeah, so we see this huge interest in death now in our time, and the idea that there could be non-medics, non-nurses, non-social workers involved around dying people. Actually, when you really think about it, of course, there's nothing more human, or nothing more human than dying. And we need to get good at it, and we need to get away from the idea that people have to be incarcerated to die behind closed doors. I mean, aren't we getting back to the fundamental that our culture denies death, and medicine above all feels it's a failure? I mean, somewhere at the heart of this is an existential crisis in our values in medicine and in the culture. We need to give well-being, health creation back to the people, for goodness sake. And I don't know how we do it, but you know, that for me, that's the way we're going to go.
I developed in a previous life working here in Wales, Wales's predictive risk tool and stratification tool, and GPC Wales and the BMA in Wales actually blocked its rollout, and we had it completely automated. It updated people's every practice patient's risk scores every single month based on multiple data sources all coming together. So it's completely automated, and it was perceived as being a performance management tool. And Wales still doesn't have any way of understanding the needs of its population. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing I wanted to say, and I've put it in the chat, there's what I consider to be the best podcast series that I've ever heard, which came out recently by two people that I'd not heard of before. It's in the chat, and everything that has been touched on today is covered in 6 episodes that are about half an hour each. It sort of focuses on clinical decision making, not in a critical way, actually in a very positive way, saying that it needs to be brought much further upstream, involve patients and clients. It talks about primary and community and support services and co-creating those services together. And the other thing that it does is, and coming back to Catherine's point, it actually challenges the protocols and guidelines. It says they are guidelines. And we should not be being, so I would really encourage everybody to listen to those, and we could have a great next session actually discussing what we took away from it, because it literally joined up all this mush in my head and made sense of it. I've listened to the whole series twice now, and each time I'm sort of cementing the different sort of points in my head. You know, it talks about our system, our health and care system is based on single diseases, and somebody with a single condition, need, whatever, is hardly ever present in the world anymore. And yet that's the system that we are perpetuating. Refers to prudent healthcare in Wales and realistic medicine in Scotland, you know, which of course, you know, we in the Bevan Commission champion.
So an end-of-life doula does is exactly what you've been describing. I mean, we are able to kind of cross over the different levels of medical professionalism and the human factor of the family and everybody else. You are that liaison in between everybody, which is just
don't know me, Craig Bishop, retired GP in Ireland. I want to pick up on David Peters's concerns that we got an existential problem affecting the whole of society, and the idea of handing it back to the people. It strikes me serendipity has stepped in again. You've got 3 filmmakers here, and for the last number of months, I've watched how you have put so much energy into a strategy aimed at well steering. There may be an opportunity, now that you've got the filmmakers here, to turn it around, flip it the other way. Maybe you need to send this message, and there's such harmony in this room. We all feel so committed to these ideas. Maybe we need to approach Jane and David and Rodrigo and try and come up with a way of getting the message out, but not in that direction to society.
Thank you. I have really, really enjoyed being with you this evening, and with hearing and reading beforehand what COIN does and what it aims to do. And it's right. It's right that you should do more neighbourhood-based and community-based and compassionate care. So I'm very excited about what might happen next. and I wish you well, and thank you for involving and engaging with the broader church, not just the medical church, but in social work and social care in particular. And I look forward to hearing from you again. So thank you.